How you doing today, folks? Studley Habit here with a class on routing, aka signal flow within Massive, which can be applied to other synthesizers as well as your effects rack within your DAW, which I'll show you more of on later, as well as a quick refresher course on what the insert effects are within Massive, how to use the feedback bus, and a little bit more to that, but we'll get into that in a little bit. First things first, I'm going to show you the free tools that I'm using. Once again, if you watch my modulation classes, you should be familiar with these. The first one is Smexoscope, which is an oscilloscope, so you can see what your wave is actually playing. So right now, as you can see, I've got a sine wave selected right there. I've already gone to my envelopes, turned the attack all the way down, got my decay level down. We'll take the release right off as well. Go back to the routing pad. So as you can see, I have it. Let me go to the default so I can show you how to use this real fast. So as you can see, as I'm playing, you can see the sine wave. Now, if I adjust the time, which is what I'm going to do, it goes into a more detailed of what's actually playing. Then we will increase the amplitude so it is more apparent what's going on. So there you go, we've got a sine wave going on. If I actually hit freeze, you can see it. On the bottom we have Voxengo Span, which is a free spectrum analyzer VST. Now this allows you to see what frequency is playing. This way you can see if you're adding any, say, harmonics or anything to the actual tone that you're creating with adding in effects or anything like that. So we'll play once again, and as you can see, it is peaking down there at 135 hertz, which is a C3, which is exactly what I'm playing on my MIDI keyboard. So this is a good way to get your tone. And like said before, I'm using a sine wave, which is a really easy way to get everything kind of sorted out with this. Alright, first things first, let's give you a quick crash course on the insert effects that you have within Massive. Now, once again, I'm going to be doing these with a sine wave. So you have none. We will go with simple delay. Now, with the delay effects, the rest of them I'm going to be doing completely in 100% wet mode. But with a delay, that will make absolutely no sense because you will just be getting the delay signal. So you need to have it set between the dry and wet. Now, if you're unfamiliar what dry and wet is, dry is the signal that's initially coming in. Wet is what is affected. The effect signal is coming out. So that's your blend of if you want a clean signal or the affected signal. So if we play this real fast, this will give you your classic echo effect. And the time is just how soon the delay goes off. It's a pretty standard effect. So the next one we have in line is sample and hold. So we'll crank this all the way to wet. Now what sample and hold does is let me get my bar off there. What sample and hold does is it goes at a certain interval, almost kind of like quantization, and grabs a sample and holds it to that point until it goes to the next cycle, which gives you a digital type of distortion, kind of like the old synthesizers of yore. So if we go up with this, the lower you have it is the lower the pitch is, the lower the rate that it samples it at. So it's going to be a lot lower of a note. So as we go up, that's why it's labeled as pitch. As we go up, it's going to be a higher pitch type sample. So you can see what kind of harmonics it's adding to it as well, right within the spectrum analyzer, and you can see what it's doing to the wave as well. So this is one of the reasons that I like using these tools, because in addition to hearing it with your ears, you can see it on the screen and what's going actually on with your waveform and with the actual frequency content. Alright, the next one we have is the Bit Crusher. Yes, some people's favorite. So what a Bit Crusher does is, this one doesn't have as many controls as most do, but it takes the sample rate it's at and brings it down. It also can do downsampling. It's pretty much the same exact thing. But if you take a look at what's going on, it basically takes the detail that's going on with the higher bit rate that you're going through. So say a standard waveform, or an MP3 if you will, is 16-bit. Right now I have this project open at 24-bit. So what it does is it crushes it down, so you don't get as much resolution to it, and you can go all the way down. Like, say if you've ever heard a Commodore 64 or one of those computers I used to grow up with that have like a SID chip, those are 4-bit to give you an idea. So as we go through this, just keep an eye on the actual waveform up here. So right now it is detailed, and as we crush it, you'll notice that the resolution goes down in it. We're also getting harmonic overtones to it. So it's no longer an actual sine wave. If what you traditionally would call a sine wave, you don't have the detail to it anymore. So instead of being a nice curve, kind of like a wave, we now have a blocky Lego-like thing right there. We also have these overtones to it as well from that, which is kind of like having a square wave. So if we compare it, we'll turn this off real quick and switch over to a square wave, from a sine to a square. Now that's in between. Now if we were to crush this square wave, you'll notice there's not that big a difference in it. But yes, that's the bit crusher. So we take a look at the next one is the frequency shifter. Now what the frequency shifter does in 100% wet mode is shifts the frequency, is exactly what it does. It's pretty self-explanatory in its name. So we have it at the bottom. So now if we go in between dry and wet, you'll still have the original signal, and you can make some, like, almost kind of like a chord if you wanted to go that way. But if you're real specific with it, you can make it so it's almost like having a detuned wave, things like that. So it can save you an oscillator if you do it wisely. And there's some interesting things you can do with it. I'll show you as well with the feedback bus later on. So the next effect we have is high pass, low pass filter. This is just a strictly utilitarian one. So instead of using the filters that you have up here, you have a extra set that you can use here. And these are just really broad ones. Pretty self-explanatory. This way you have some extra utilitarian ones. Now the next two we have are wave shapers. I'm not going to go into the specifics of the difference between them, as you'll be able to see it as I'm messing with it. But if you want the specifics behind the math of the difference between the sine shaper and the parabolic shaper, take a look in the manual or on Wikipedia. It's kind of an involved process, the math that goes on with wave shaping. But what wave shaping is another form of distortion that reshapes the waveform that's coming through it. So we'll just take a quick look at it. This is the sine shaper. As you can see, sine wave still, and it applies more as I apply a drive to it. As you can see, we're adding more overtones to it. Once again, why it's useful to have these tools open, in addition to your ears. Now we'll take a look at the parabolic shaper. Same thing, except this wave shaper turns it more into a squared off wave instead of more sine overtones like the last one. Then the last one we have is the hard clipper. That's exactly what it is it clips the waveform. So as we add to it, it squares off the tops of it. So we go from a sine wave to a squared off wave. Now let's start taking a look at the actual routing table. If you're unfamiliar where it is, how to open this up, all you have to do is go down here. You have your oscillator, key tracking os, voicing, and it's right next to it, routing. Now, if you're unfamiliar with this actual tab or what this diagram is, it basically shows you a visual layout of how your signal flows through the whole synthesizer. So you have your oscillators right here, oscillator 1, 2, 3, and your fourth one right here, the noise oscillator. Those four are represented right here, and this is the signal flow that it goes through. So if we just trace it from oscillator 1, we're going from oscillator 1. This B here stands for bypass, which goes to the bypass bus right there. We'll have a little bit more on that later. But we follow it from oscillator 1, which goes, you have the option here to turn on your insert 1 and 2 effects. We'll go over these symbols a little bit more in detail later. Then you go into the filter 1, back out, you have more options here. Then it goes to the amp and panning right here. So you're going oscillator 1, filter 1, to the amp panning right there. From amp panning, it goes down to your effects units right here. So you have effects 1, effects 2, and EQ. And from there, it goes to the master bus right there. So that's the basic flow that you're going from one oscillator. All the oscillators, you get a choice of what you do with them. If we take a look right here, there's some also other routing options right here. You have filter 1, filter 2. So if you switch it all the way up to filter 1, it's just being passed filter 1. Now if I go to filter 2, it's just being passed filter 2. Now in the center, it's being sent, the signal's being sent to both of them. And if you're unfamiliar with the filter section, we'll just go over it really quick. You have the option of serial or parallel. Now, a quick trick that will help people remember this is if you take lines, say you have things that are in two objects that are parallel to each other. They are next to each other. So you'd have a line here, those would be parallel to each other. Now, serial means they are going into each other, or in series. So, if I have this cranked all the way up to serial, it goes signal oscillator 1 will go into filter 1, which will then be outputted into filter 2 before it comes out. So, we'll switch that back to the center. So, that's just a quick overlay of what that does for the filter. That's one routing option you have right there. Now, as I mentioned before, we have the feedback bus, which is right here. Let me make sure that's turned back on. Now, what the feedback bus does is, depending on where you turn it on in your routing table, it takes the signal where you turned it on. So if I go here, feedback bus right there, I can turn it on right there. What it does is it takes it and it feeds it right back into the filter section one more time. So it's almost acts like a saturator if you don't have any effects or anything turned on it. Let me just put the insert effect there. I have nothing, well, I have nothing turned on in my insert effects right now, so I'll show it to you real fast and the differences it makes on where you place it. So we have my sine wave open, and right now I have the feedback bus. I want to call it a filter for some reason, but the feedback bus that feeds right back into the filter. So this is just going to be feeding into filter 1. I'm just going to have it all the way up. Now, as I turn up the amplitude on this, saturation rate. Now you notice if I, and this depends on where you actually have it set up. As I was saying before, the positions where you place it. So if I put it there, we get the same thing. But if I put it after, right there, well, you'll notice it takes a bit more before it goes extreme. So if we place it at the final place, you can get pretty extreme with what it does. It actually kicks in the filters more too, because you're getting a hotter signal that's flowing into it. If, say, I was to put a low pass on here, or yeah, let's just put a low pass, crank the resonance up a little bit. Now, if you do this with some of the other filters that have some of the more extreme effects to them, let's do a screen filter. You can notice you can do some pretty extreme things with it. So that's something to keep in mind that you can mess around with. And another trick that I'll show you with the actual feedback filter, let me just turn this off. As I was mentioning before with the frequency shifter, you have the option with the dry and wet, but if you put it as an insert effect right on the feedback filter, turn the amplitude down on that before I rape someone's ears. So right now we have that added as the feedback filter, and also something of note, as I showed you on your noise oscillators, you can do the same thing with where you route your feedback filter to be going into. So like I said, it's feeding back into the filter section. You can route it into both filters, or you can just route it into one or the other. So now if I was to add an insert effect on this, this will be something more. If we do some more frequency shifter, let's add some more overtone to it. So we'll put this before the actual feedback filter on here. So the second insert will have another frequency shifter. So you can see I'm coming up with a pretty complex wave tone just with one oscillator already. And this is just defaulting with a sine wave. Okay, so we'll turn off the feedback filter for now. Now the next thing we're going to go over is the insert effect placement. Now depending on where you place an effect in your chain is going to come up with a different sound to it. Say if I was to put a delay before the filter. Actually, let's do that real quick. We'll go simple delay. Turn it down. We've got decent timing. Let me turn that effect off real fast. So you can hear the delay going on right now. Now if I was to put a filter on this, we will go with a low pass. Turn the resonance down. Now the delay isn't as noticeable. But if I was to put it after the actual filter, it's more noticeable once again. Now what's happening, the difference between these two, let me just turn this off again, is beforehand we're delaying the original oscillator signal. Then it's being fed into the filter, which is low passing it, which is low passing the actual delay that's being added. The other way, if I put it post it, like there, is when I'm putting it through, the original oscillator is getting filtered first, then you're making your delay signal. So it's, like I said, the differences can be subtle, but the more effects that you stack on top of each other, the more apparent it can get. The other thing worth noting, this is not going to be so much the case in Massive as it would with, say, traditional effects within your DAW. Actually, I'm not going to close the Massive window right now, because if I open the effects tab, it would be confusing for those of you who don't use Cubase. But if I was to put, say, a bit crusher right here, and then insert effect 2, let's see, right here, we'll go to bit crushed. So we'll crush it right there. Then if I was to put a delay here, in theory what would happen is it's going to take all the detail out of it before it inserts the delay. But the delay will still be high quality. So what we're doing is we're downsampling this from, say, a 24-bit wave or a 16-bit to, say, 4-bit, or lacking the detail as you can see up there. But the delay effect that you have after it is still going to be high fidelity. So it'd still be a 16-bit style delay or whatever it is with the actual quality of the effect. But if, once again, I was to switch this around and have the delay first before I have the bit crushing, we'd have a high fidelity delay right there that would be being crushed down to, say, 4 bits. So the difference there is going to be more if you stack more effects on top of each other, you notice it more and more. But if you look at the positions that you can put your effects on, your insert effects, you have before the filter, post filter, and once again in between. So if I was to have a feedback loop right there, you can have the insert effects right there. As I showed before, you can put an insert effect right directly on the feedback loop. You have positions right there. Then after you have all your filters and your summing right there, the mixing before you go to your amp panning, you have the option of another insert place or a feedback filter. Post it, you don't have any more options. So before you go into your amplifying and panning, which is right there, you have the option to add it, which is post your filter mixes. So if you take a look at where it sums right there, that is the mix bus right there. So the mixing between your filter 1 and filter 2 outputs. So if I crank that up, we can take a look at this. We'll go with a square wave on the second oscillator again. Have that routed all through filter 2. So right now we have a sine wave and a square wave playing. It's just playing a mix of 1. Actually turn off the insert effects, that's what's doing that. So we should have a sine wave. If I keep it all the way to the top, mix 1. Go down to mix 2, it will just be the square wave. Now if we go to the center, it will be both of them. So what we're doing is routing the sine wave through filter 1, and these are both in parallel. So filter 1 is just getting the sine wave, filter 2 is just getting the square wave, and here is where we're controlling the mixing of it before it goes to the amplifier and panning. So that's where we're mixing the signal right there, as I showed before. Now the other symbol we haven't gone over yet that is on the routing table right here is this B, which stands for bypass. The bypass bus is up here, which is that right there. So if I have oscillator 3 on bypass right now, so I still have it routed. Let me go to mix 1, mix 2. We'll take oscillator 3, turn it on, crank it all the way up. We'll go to another sine wave. So we'll isolate it real fast. Turn off those two oscillators, switch over to a sine wave. We're going to go in the sub range. So we're going to go down an octave from our initial wave. So right now it is bypassing the filters. If I turn this, actually what we're going to do is crank this up. So what it's doing right now is being routed right to the EQ section. You have the option of where it places it in the actual signal flow. So if I was to switch it right here, it would go to effects 1 first, then to effects 2, then the EQ, or if I can bypass effects 1 if I choose, and it will just bypass straight into effects 2, then to the EQ unit, or you can go right past that into the EQ unit into the master. So this will bypass any filter that I have turned on right now. So if I turn on a low pass filter, we'll crank this all the way to F1. It still goes through it, but it's still being passed straight to the bypass module. See, if I turn the amplitude down on it, the amplifier, it's completely bypassed. So right now, it's not being sent to the signal or anything like that. I'm controlling the volume for it right here on the bypass. So this is a way, say you want to add a sub to, if you come up with a baseline that has, say, mid-range content or something like that. So I can open one up real fast. Let's see. Open sound. Bro wobbles. Let's see what this is. So if we take a look at this, I have it actually bypassing. So I can turn amplitude down. Oh, of course I don't have the oscillator turned on. So let's go up an octave. So as you can see, it's bypassed right now. I'll turn these on. So that's adding a sublayer to it. Let me just go back down an octave and we'll initialize the sound again. So you don't get assaulted with that kind of bro step, whatever I was making with that patch. We'll go back to a sine wave. But yes, as I said, it completely is independent of the amplifier volume if you have bypass turned on. So we have bypass turned on, amplifier's turned all the way down, and we control the volume right with the bypass. Go back to sine wave for both of them. So that's pretty self-explanatory what that does. Now the last thing we're going to take a look at is post our amp and panning section, which we haven't really taken a look at. But if we take a look at it, it's pretty self-explanatory. You have your amp panning right here. So your amp is affected by, right now, the 4 envelope. So that is affecting the amplitude of the actual sound. And if I was to switch it to, say, 3, do that real fast. See how the envelope's affecting the sound, and 4 envelopes set up. It's steady with no attack to it. Well, the attack turned all the way down. You still have a slight attack to it, and no release to it. So it's just snap. And if we take a look at the panning, that's self-explanatory, left or right. Which you could control click with stuff, but for some reason you can't. So if we go back to the routing table, this is the way the signal's flowing. As I was explained before, you go to your amp pan. The last thing we're going to take a look at is the effects section and your EQ before you hit master. So here you have some more effects. These I'm not going to really explain except for a couple of them. They're all pretty standard fare effects that you can look up what they actually do within the manual, or you should be familiar with using any of these effects for the most part. So you have a reverb, a smaller reverb, a flanger, got actually 4 flangers, a chorus, mono chorus, another chorus ensemble, phaser mono, delay synced, dimension expander. This is one we'll take a look at real fast. The dimension expander is an actual interesting effect in the context of Massive. I'm personally not a fan of a lot of the effects in Massive, but this one is interesting because it combines a delay unit and a chorus. And what it does is it really thickens out your sound and makes it, well, besides thickening, makes it more also stereo presence to it. It's kind of hard. Let me actually just go all the way wet. It's not really as apparent with a sine wave. Square wave. So you can hear the slight delay to it and the chorus, but the way that it's controlled, just a couple knobs, it's really interesting effect. So it pretty simplifies it, and it's one of the few things, the effects for the post ones that I like. And the tubes are kind of like what I'm actually speaking through right now. Say a tube preamp, which is what I'm using with my microphone. So you get an emulation of an analog tube, which anyone who's used analog gear with tubes knows. Gives it a nice warm sound to it, and you can do some really nice warm overdrive. Go back to the sine wave. So as you see, as we drive it up more, we get some nice tones to it. I don't have any feedback turned on. Turn the drive all the way down. Standard sine. So we're getting some nice warm overtones to it again. So as we take a look at this, those are your standard effects. So what it would be routed to is, if we have our insert effects, the way we have them set up right now, is it would be going oscillator, whatever oscillators you have turned on. Right now we just have one oscillator. So oscillator 1 going bypassing where we have a point there, since we don't have the insert turned on. So it's oscillator 1, we've got bypass. Well, actually, we'll leave it on just for the sake of showing you how you can do some more with it. So if I wanted to double the actual amplitude volume that I have for oscillator 1, I could crank the bypass on this. So now we're doubling the actual volume of oscillator 1. Bypass, and it's going into... So oscillator 1 going into the bypass. So we have oscillator 1 bypassing into effects 1 with the volume there, and oscillator 1 is also going through this line right here. So it's going to filter 1. We have no filter there, but if we wanted to add one, we could. Then we have insert effect 1, so whatever we have there. We have the option of putting a feedback loop if we want, right at that position, but we're not. So then we're going through our filter mixing, and since it's just one oscillator and not going through 2 filters, is at that point, which would be the mixer right there. Then it goes to insert 2, which we have nothing turned on, but it would be that right there is insert 2. We have the option for feedback again if we wanted to put it there. Then we go into the amp panning section right there. Option for feedback before we go to the master, before we go to the effects. So we could place that there. Then we go into the effects section. So it goes into effects 1 right there. And as I said before, the bypass is going into effects 1. So at this point, the bypass right there, and this will be going into effects 1, effects 2 right there, and the EQ. Now something I'm gonna say right here might piss off some massive users. I am not a fan of the EQ in this. I tend to try to avoid to use it because it's so simplified, and you can just go into your actual DAW and use a better EQ with more control to it. Don't get mad, it's just my opinion, but you have usually within your DAW a lot better EQs than the one in here, so I tend to leave it off. And then from there you are going into your master volume, right there. So that's the signal flow within Massive, and as I said before, this can be applied to other synths. They usually don't have this fancy diagram that you can look at, but it also can be applied to hardware. And as I was saying before, if you've ever used, say, Reason or something like that, you're pretty familiar with this if you've looked at the back panel of Reason. It's kind of like a modular synth. If you've ever seen a picture of, say, a Moog modular, one of those beasts that looks like an old telephone patching station, where you have different modules and you actually use patch cords to route what goes to where, and the same thing is the back of Reason, or even if you're a guitar player, how you chain up your effects pedals. It's all the same concept. This is just virtual cables right here. And since now you know what virtual cables do, you can do the same thing with actual physical hardware. If I was to pull up a picture of the patch base sitting next to me and the hardware, you'd be able to see that just like in Massive, depending on where I actually patch things, say I have my hardware synthesizer going into an effects unit or something like that, it'd be the same thing, except instead of having all the oscillators and stuff like that, it would be my synthesizer signal sound coming out into the option of going into, say, I have, next to me I've got a tube limiter and some distortion pedals. So if I was to go into the distortion pedal first, then into the tube limiter, it would sound different than if I was going into the tube limiter and into the distortion pedals. Like I said before, it's something you have to experiment with where you actually place the effects in your chain. Because, as I said before, you can come up with different sounds depending on where they are. And the more you stack effects on top of each other, the more apparent it's going to be. But this also can be applied to your DAW. If you take a look at the manual, into your actual effects and send sections. So if you have insert effects or a group bus or something like that, depending on where you place your effects on it, is going to depend on what the sound that's going to come at the end. So it's something you definitely want to spend some time practicing and experimenting with, because it's one of the key points of sound design and actual sound processing. Hopefully you guys learned a lot. If you have any questions, feel free to get at me, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. But this has been Deadly Habit for Massive Synth. Check you guys later.